G'day guys, this video is to unpack the extended response question from the mock exam, give you some insights and some structures that maybe will help you in the upcoming EA. The question is laid out here, sources 1 to 7 in the stimulus book. Analyse the sources to evaluate the costs and benefits of changing the monetary policy stance from the perspective of Australian households. So we have to analyse, we have to evaluate costs and benefits of changing monetary policy. This was a big one that people struggled with, the idea of changing it. Do we raise cash rate? Or do we lower it? CR, cash rate. Do we lower it? And why? And why? Why would you choose those options? These are the things we want you to think about when you're doing these questions. And we want to look at it from the perspective and the impact or the effect on Australian households. So about the lined pages of the exam book, there was 83 lines for the question with additional pages if you needed them. Most of you guys write about 8 words a line. So if you filled that booklet, you would have written over the word length, just over the word length. If you are just over the word length, apparently in the external, you can write as much as you want, but your goal should be to at least fill the lines, fill up all the available space in the lines and then some. Okay, that's the first goal. 28 marks it was worth, just up here, 28 of the 65 of the whole paper. About 40% of your paper was on this one question. Step 1, know your question. So let's look at it again. It's worth 28 marks. Analyse, evaluate costs and benefits of up or down monetary policy stance. So are we going to go expansionary? Let's get some language in. Or are we going to think contractionary? At this point, what are we going to do? And we've got to think about the costs and benefits for Australian households. So we want to think about changing it up or down. We have to figure out what we're going to do. We have to figure this change. We've got to figure out the change. Figure this out. Super important to figure this out. Know your question. 2, know your data. I'm just going to change my pen here. Hope to make it a bit easier for me. Okay, so know your data. So I'm going to highlight a few things here. We're going to look at these in a bit more detail. But I'm just going to put a little highlight through source 1, spending in Australia, and source 7, motor vehicle sales. Both of these represent consumption. Both of these represent consumption. So all of a sudden we start to think about, well, consumption is a factor, or is an element, is it a factor, of our aggregate demand formula. Okay, so we're looking at consumption here. Second one we've got here is the labour market, employment. Now, employment's going to have a flow-on effect to our levels of consumption. Low unemployment means more people working, likely means more people buying stuff. So suddenly we can sort of look at it and go, well, yeah, we can see that labour market is falling and motor vehicle sales are up. There's a connection straight away. And the next one we're going to look at here is this one over here, this source 6, non-residential construction prices. These are office buildings and factories and things like that. Okay, so we're looking at the building and the engineering costs. We'll look at those in a bit more detail, but I just want to highlight those first sources for you. We then have some other data here, which shows up around, I'm going to go to green for this one here, shows up around the perspective of households. Okay, we're starting to get a bit of a picture of where is our economy at this point. Then we've got to go, what's our perspective of households? So we can see that there's pensioners involved here in green, source 3. Personal savings to support themselves. Government pension is a source of income. That won't change with any change to monetary policy. They'll still get their pension. Census data. Okay, home ownership. And also people who are renting, down the bottom there. We're going to see people who are renting come into play in this one. We then can also see, and a lot of you picked up on this, that we have quite high levels of household debt here in Australia. just do this one green. This is for Australia. Especially compared to other developed nations. So we're looking here at comparable countries to us in terms of quality of life and living standards and those sorts of things. Okay, quite high levels of debt already. So we have a lot of mortgages at the moment. We owe a lot of money already. And a lot of you sort of said, oh, house prices in Australia are expensive and all that kind of thing. The reality is we don't actually have data on house prices here. So we've got to rely only on this data that's in front of us. So we've got some highlighted yellow, some highlighted green. Step 2, understand your data. We're going to keep unpacking this through the next few slides, guys. Step 3 is the economic problem. What is the big issue that the question's asking you to think about? Okay? And really in these ones here, because it's macroeconomics, we want you to think about what is the overall state of the economy? Where is the economy at the moment on the business cycle? Where are we on the business cycle? What evidence supports this? What's your analysis look like on this? And then what are some positives and negatives that can occur when we're at this point of the business cycle? And so when I first looked at this question, I actually, I didn't write the answer, but I went through, before I looked through the rubric to mark your 50 odd papers, I went through and I had to think about this and I thought, well, how would I unpack it? And I looked at the data, I looked at the question, I went, how would I unpack it? And the first thing I do is I always go to my ADAS model, just down the bottom here, just to sort of have a feel and a play with it. And let's just mark up our AD and our aggregate supply using our Keynesian aggregate supply curve. And now I can see price level in the economy. And I can see a level of GDP. I'm just going to call this here. I'm going to call it, I'll call it GDP. But I could also call it, let's put it here, could be employment, GDP or employment. Employment, you know when I say write EMP, I mean employment. Okay, so that's our current level of GDP and employment. And I'll just see if I can get, it's hard to get clear pen markings on this. I don't like my PowerPoint on here. But what we're looking at here is that we can sort of look at, and I'm just going to scroll and I can go and look at that. I'm seeing here, I'm going to look at durable goods to start with. Durable goods in 2023 have gone from here to here, quite an attractive trend. So durable goods last a long time, more than 3 years is usually the thing. And that's projected to increase, to continue to increase into 2024, okay? At the same time, we can see some other funky lines for machinery and for non-durable goods consumption. Non-durable goods consumption, I think, is this one here, right? Now, that's things like food and services, like the stuff you consume on a day-to-day basis. So that makes sense that that's not going to go up much. But durable goods, things we want to buy, like I went to the bike shop today, right? Now, I'm looking at that going, it's time to make a purchase. And that kind of says to me that in terms of where we are on the business cycle, we're starting to see lots of consumption. And I can also see that down the bottom here in motor vehicle sales. Motor vehicle sales are on the rise and expected to go up. Once again, durable goods, lots of consumption happening. So if I think about lots of consumption going up, I can go, therefore, AD is rising. Just on that first alone. So now let's go back to my ADAS model. And now I'm going to say, well, assuming that AD is up, my AD curve shifts to the right, AD1. And this now starts to make a bit more sense. I see my GDP shift to the right. I go from there to there. Okay, so GDP's shifted outwards, more GDP, but that also means more equals more employment, more jobs. I'll get rid of that. More jobs. More jobs equals a drop in unemployment. That's what the theory tells us. And we can see it. In the labour market, source 2, just above that, we see that that's coming through. That drop is going down there. And consequently, we now look at it and I go, the positive implication at this state of the business cycle, my positive, is falling unemployment. Now, if unemployment's falling, what's happening to the level of income in the society? It's increasing. Level of income increases. Once again, we go back to our friend over there, the C, and the consumption's increasing. Once again, aggregate demand will continue to rise. We're seeing people buying cars, we're seeing people buying durable goods, those kind of more discretionary purchases, and a lot of you picked up on that thing about discretionary purchasing. Okay? But there are negative implications when the economy is at this location of the business cycle. And the most likely one here is PL1. The negative implication, back up to my notes here, is that we're starting to see inflation. Okay. And I actually know this from source 6. Source 6 highlights, I'll just go back to source 6 over here. Source 6 actually highlights that inflation is probably starting to happen. Well, you think about your ADAS model for a second here. AD is shifted to the right. We kind of shifted up the AS, the new equilibrium on the AS curve. We're seeing an increase in output, makes sense, okay, it makes sense, the increase in output, but it also means that we're seeing things at higher prices. And if we now look at source 6 to the right side of the page here, let's see how we can map this out. Source 6 has some interesting stuff. Source 6 tells us in the dotted lines, work done, okay? And that dotted line in buildings, that's on the rise. And work started, commencements, work started, it's on the rise. And it's the same for the engineering. The engineering work with all these factories and office blocks and all that, it's all on the rise. So that means that work is getting started and work is getting finished. Okay, work is getting started and work is getting finished. And that means it's creating jobs and it's adding to consumption and there's an aggregate demand factor at work, but consequently, we're probably going to start to see inflation. But the question is how much inflation? The critical concern in source 6 is that work yet to be done from that drop that I've just put with the red dot to where it is now, work yet to be done is rising. And it happens at the same point over in engineering as well. Put a nice big red dot here, except engineering goes way, 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 way up here. Now, this is where it gets tricky with these external exams, guys. You kind of have to understand that you need to do the engineering to build the building. And there's nothing that kind of we teach you that in our course that teaches that's the way it happens. But the fact that there's an increase in work yet to be done means that we can look at it and go, well, if they've got all this work that's coming in, but they're not getting it out, there's all this work to be done, work yet to be done, or more work to do, they're going to start to put their prices up. We're going to see profit in motive come into play here. They're going to start to rise the prices there, okay? This increase in work to be done means an increase in demand. And what do we call that? Increase in demand equals increase in demand pull inflation. And especially in this engineering side, this big rise here, this big rise in the work yet to be done. There's lots of demand out there, but they obviously don't have the workers available now to do this stuff, to do all this work, okay? That looks like if you have more work than you can handle, you are working at capacity. And when we think about working at capacity, just get some space over here for myself, working at capacity, we can actually draw that back to our production possibilities frontier. They're working here, they might do a bit of overtime, they might get a little bit outside, but they're not going to stay there for very long. They're really going to have to go here and they'll make some decisions whether they go different locations on it, but essentially the PPC or the PPC, Production Possibilities Curve, tells us that they are working at capacity. They're working at capacity as an economy. And if we think back to our labour market now, if we go to our labour market here, we're seeing that the labour market unemployment rate is about 4%. Some of you picked up on that. 4% is the NAIRU at the moment in Australia. Roughly 4 to 4.5% equals the NAIRU. Okay, so when we think about that, at 4 5% or below for unemployment, theory tells us we will see inflation. Wages start rising, cost push inflation. So at the Nauru, we will see inflation. So now we start to get really granular on this. We know from source 1 and source 7 that demand is up. Demand is up. Source 1 and source 7 tell us that. Source 2 tells us labour market is at full employment. We then also see that our construction industry is at capacity. We can link that back to a graph down the bottom there. Now guys, I'm going to keep recording this video, but I would suggest you pause this video at this point, take a breath and have a drink, and then we're going to keep going through the next steps. So pause the video now. Okay, we're back to it now. Let's move on to our next slide. I'll just jump back. There we go. So we've kind of analysed all this stuff here. I actually missed a step. So we've done all the analysis. So based on what you have analysed to reach this conclusion, using the question for guidance, explain how and why government should intervene. And in this case, through a change in monetary policy stance. Now we have an economy which is cooking pretty hot. So therefore, what do you think we should do with our monetary policy stance? We don't know what it is at the moment, but what should we do based on the conditions we see in front of us now? What should we be thinking about doing? And answer the question now. That's right. We should be thinking about increasing the cash rate. We should be thinking about increasing cash rate. This is a really messy slide now, so I'll keep going. So we want to increase the cash rate. We want to start to slow our economy down to manage inflation. And that's why the question when it says monetary policy, you kind of go, oh, it's about managing inflation. Okay, so pause the video, have a digest through this and think about it for yourself. Okay, back to it. Step 4. We've looked through the issue, we've justified the issue with our analysis, and you've got to write all that down in your paper. Then we've got to think about evaluating the costs and the benefits. So now we understand that the RBA should raise the cash rate. And you have to explain this clearly with reasoning. We're going to talk more about this as we go through. I'm not going to tell you what the I'm not going to explain the marking guide, but I want to go through it and say this is kind of what you got to think about. So now we've got to go, what's our theoretical basis? Okay, we have to know our channels of monetary policy transmission. We have to know the effects. And then we have to evaluate the costs and benefits. And most importantly, just using the available evidence. Sources 1 to 7, once again. So let's break this down a little bit in terms of the transmission, effects, and see how we can use some of this evidence to start it off. I'm going to focus first of all on the 3 data sets we didn't use in the previous step. That's source 3, pension incomes, source 4, census data, and source 5, household debt. Okay. So what does this tell us here? The government pension remains the main source of income for many retirees. Okay, so pensions won't be like with inflation erodes purchasing power. So we assume, ceteris paribus, we assume no change to the pension, which means that at this point with inflation, these guys are going to be worse off. So therefore, if we raise the cash rate, CR, likelihood equals drop in prices. Therefore, pension maintains, start a new line, maintains purchasing power, PP. Okay. So first of all, we can say, well, this is theoretically, this is what would happen. The second point here is actually a bit of a different argument. About 3 million Australians need their personal savings to support themselves. Now, increasing the cash rate equals increase in interest rates. People, retirees, so therefore, when you have your savings in the bank, savings equals, with interest rates rising, equals more return on investment. Pensioners, people on savings, people with money in savings account, they love it when the interest rates go up. They love it because they're getting more money on their savings. That's the savings channel in the transmission of monetary policy. This is where you've got to know your stuff. So we're looking here, we're going to raise the cash rate. Okay, we're going to raise the cash rate. Go back to my words up here. We're going to raise the cash rate. We're going to have contractionary stance. We want to slow the economy down. It's starting to overheat. Demand is getting too high. Inflation's getting too high. So the pensioners turn around. They go, well, our purchasing power, and the government can't just raise the pension all the time based on inflation. They've got to look at that and go, what do we do with that? But we're just going to focus on the data we have here in front of us. Okay. Let's look at source 4 here. We see that pensioners would actually really benefit from this, and the transmission mechanism would work in their favour. They're looking pretty good. Let's look at our contractionary stance here. So I'm using the evidence I've got. In recent times, there has been much debate about the rate of home ownership and housing affordability. Remember that housing affordability, cheap loans equals rising housing prices. Cheap loans, which is what happened during COVID, cheap loans are due to, equals increase in demand. Cheap access to money increases demand, therefore increases housing prices. There were nearly 8.8 million Australian households. So we got 8.8 million households and 3 million pensioners. Okay, 3 million pensioners and 8.8 million households. And this is where I have a few actual hassles with the question. Householders' tenure was known. 5.9 million households were homeowners and 2.8 did not have a mortgage. Okay, so there's 5.9 million households, 2.8 million. Let's do the maths on that. That gets us down to, therefore, 3 million households have a mortgage. Hey, look, it's the same as the pensioners. Now, 2.8 million households don't have a mortgage. If you don't have a mortgage, no mortgage equals no effect from monetary policy on your mortgage, okay? You've probably got some savings in the bank, we don't know that. But if you don't have a mortgage, this change to the cash rate will not actually turn around and affect you too much, okay? Now then there's also the renters. There's 1.9 million were renters. Renters, if cash rate rises, rent rises. If cash rate rises, rent rises. Okay? The rent-seeking individuals that hold investment properties, whenever there's an interest rate rise, they tend to pass it on to the renter, to the consumer. And that's something we've seen recently. You might have seen a lot of that happening in the news at the moment around this sort of stuff, where the renters are turning around and their rent in Brisbane's going up, and they're saying, well, someone's got to pay the cost for my extra mortgage. And what happens is it ends up with the renters. So we've really got three groups we're looking at here in society now. Three groups. Three household groups. Pensioners, mortgage, and non-mortgage homeowners, and renters. And what we can start to see now, I'm just going to change colour for a sec, what we can sort of think about is that pensioners, they get a win. Non-mortgage, they get a win. They're likely the ones who own the other properties as well. The mortgages, not great for them, and the renters, not great for them. So different groups of households have different outcomes from the rise in the cash rate. It's important to note, important to mention. The question is it worth doing still? We still got to go. Well, we can see there's now some different groups will benefit, some other groups will have higher mortgage repayments, and we've got to start saying, well, what's the benefit here? Okay. Now, there's a bit of another issue we've got to think about as well. A lot of you mentioned about this here, source 5, household debt. Australia, once again, we can see it just here. Higher levels of household debt. If cash rate rises, we already have household debt and we're high compared to other nations, okay? We're high compared to all these other nations. If cash rate rises, household debt. What happens to household debt? What happens, do you think? What happens to interest repayments? Interest repayments rise. You've still got to pay back the original cost of the house. You've still got to pay back your principal, like what you bought the house for on the mortgage. So if you bought the house for $1 million, you still owe $1 million. Interest repayments rise. The problem with interest repayments rising is that this is what's happening recently. I've been hearing some stories about this around the place. Is that in my little area, someone bought a house for $800,000, and then they spent another $100,000 fixing it up, and they paid stamp duty and all that kind of thing. And then the market's got much tougher in the last 6 months, or with the interest rate rises we've been having in Australia, and they've recently sold that house because they had to get rid of it because they couldn't afford it. They put in $800,000, they put in $100,000 out of renovations, $900,000 they've put in all up on it now. They recently sold it for $780,000, less than what they bought it for after all the work they've done. So they still owe the bank the $900,000 plus interest, but they could only get $780,000 back out of the house. If you're looking at it as a business, you've made a loss, okay, on that deal, which is what these people who flip these houses are trying to do. Now, so what would happen? So therefore, debt is going to rise as well. We're probably going to see an increase in debt, and that's going to make it more challenging compared to our neighbours and everything there. Okay, so that's the other three data sources. Pause it, once again, have a break, and then keep rolling on. And we're back to it. As you can see from top there, slide 7 of 8, this is the last sort of big one. Oh, well, there we are. Okay, so now we've got to say, well, how would these things flow back to all our data sets? So we raise the cash rate, and I'm going to maybe do some speculative thing here. We do some forecasting now. Do it in red. Raise the cash rate, and we're probably going to see, off the back of that, we'll probably start to see that durable goods will do that. Yeah? You see my little arrow here? I'm just up the top, just in here. This is what I'm looking at here. Non-durable goods, probably going to continue about the same pace. Car sales, down here, source 7. Car sales probably start to level off a bit, maybe drop a bit. Okay, we can start to see that there. But the price pressure is going to leave the economy. Price pressure is down, generally speaking. We're still going to see that building work will go on, but we'll see that the distance between the building, what is intended to be done, and like the work in the pipeline, the work in the pipeline is where I've just drawn the dotted line, that's in the pipeline. We're going to see that work in the pipeline start to come back more in line with what we can actually achieve as an economy. Because basically, this source 6 here, we're working above capacity. Okay, we're working above capacity. We're building a lot of stuff. Okay, we're building a lot of stuff because there's high demand in the economy. And that's kind of where we start to think through that. Okay, so you've got to talk through each of those things in your data set. Evaluate, once again, let's go back to the top here. Evaluate costs and benefits using the data. Okay, just do some little green highlighting. Okay, let's finish up, guys. If you've made it this far, well done. It's quite a long video. In summary, know your question. Understand your data. Identify the economic problem, the issue, okay? Assume there's an issue and assume that the government is going to be involved. Analyse the current situation. Where are we on the business cycle? This is macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is all about the business cycle. Support with the evidence in front of you, the sources, quantify the data, calculate data, percentage changes. Maybe just do one, just chuck one in just to make sure you've done one. Link it back to your theory. I did ADAS and I've done production possibilities on this question. You can give it a shot. Explain how and why government should intervene. In this case, they should change, because here they said change, and that confused everything. They said, what should we do with the change? If they raised it or lowered it. But you have to know the state of the economy as it is now. The change in this one is, once again, what is it? Raising cash rate. Know your perspective. Households. So you don't need to say the effects on businesses. You don't say what's going to happen for businesses or anything like that. You might say, well, unemployment's going to start to rise and that's going to affect households in another way. Okay, so you can look through all those data sets now and say, what's going to happen to unemployment? It's going to rise. Consumption's going to fall. Business investment's going to fall. But the main thing is how we're thinking about it in terms of households. Be clear on your position. Okay, understand that when we look through this question, given the overall state of our position on the business cycle, probably at a peak, the best thing overall, even though there's some hard decisions to be made, the best thing overall is raising the cash rate. Even though there's going to be some negatives, it's going to really, we've got to get stuff under control, because if we let inflation get out of control, then it's going to cause its own economic downturn further down the track, like the natural business cycle. And what happens is the trough would be significantly worse and would last significantly longer. The trough would last longer and be significantly deeper. That's why the government tries to have these little nudges of the economy in the right direction. Unpack both sides of the argument, costs and benefits. There was another question that we did in class. Once again, I'll just put it here, was on housing demand versus supply. I think all the classes did that question. Okay, support it with the evidence, sources, data, quantify, calculate, and the limitations. I mean, in the one here, the limitation or the negative implications, the one in this one's debt. Okay, now, if I look back across the marking guide, if you kind of went through that process, it doesn't mean you're going to hit every single mark for that 28 mark question. Okay, there's probably something you'll miss along the way. But I hope that this is enough of a structure to definitely get you and it would definitely get you up into the 20s out of 28, okay? But it's the really granular appreciation of it and the extended response answer that's going to get you across the line. This question in the exam probably needs an hour's work, 55 minutes work. It's a significant question, okay? And if you fluff these big questions, if you go off track with them, it can have a really big impact on the marking of your overall paper. Guys, well done getting to the end, okay? I hope this was helpful and it gives you something to reflect upon, because we will look at it in class, but it gives you a bit more chance to go through it. Okay, cheers guys.